Okay, so good morning, everyone. I see participants are still joining us online, um, but perhaps we could start because we have an hour and an interesting webinar ahead of us. My name is Yasmina Byrne. I'm Chief of Policy in the new Unicef Office of Global Insight and Policy. We were previously in the Division of Data Research and Policy. This is our first webinar on digital literacy for children. One of the work streams of our new office is digital connectivity, and digital literacy in particular is one of the areas that is getting a lot of attention worldwide. So this webinar is really to share our initial work and the scoping study we did on digital literacy concepts and approaches, different frameworks that exist, with the aim to really stimulate a debate. It is intended both for Unicef audience, but also for external partners and an external audience to help integrate children's issues better into the digital literacy work. So with that very short introduction, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have three panelists. The first is Fabio Ambani. He works as an assistant professor of the Universidad Internacional de La Rioja, where he holds the Telefonica Chair on Digital Society and Education. He's a senior fellow of the European Distance Learning Network and a member of the advisory board of the Open Education Working of the Open Knowledge Foundation. He's been active in the field of learning innovation and ICT for learning since 1998, and he works across Europe, Latin America, Caribbean, and South Mediterranean, as well as Southeast Asia. His main research interests are digital literacy, social and digital inclusion, and open education. Then I'd like to introduce my colleague, Stephen Voss Liu. He's one of the digital specialists in our team, in our Office of Global Insight and Policy, and he works particularly in areas and leads our work on artificial intelligence and child rights and digital literacy. He has experience in mobile learning, youth and digital inclusion. And before UNICEF, he worked for UNESCO and non-profit and private sector in South Africa, France, and the UK. And finally, I'd like to introduce our colleague Basim Nasir from education section. He's education specialist responsible for driving the work on skills education team, including the development of the global framework on transferable skills and supporting regional and country offices to implement their work in this area. Earlier in his career, he worked at Intel Corporation, Ministries of Education and Higher Education in MENA to enhance quality of education through technology. So I'm going to give a floor first to Fabio and Stephen, and they have about 25 minutes to talk to us about the paper they did together on digital literacy for children. Then Basim will have about 5 minutes to provide commentary from the education perspective. And in the end, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. You'll see in your Zoom setup a chat function where you are invited to ask any questions. You can introduce yourself or we see your name. And please indicate to who this question is addressed to. And also turn your setting on to all panelists, to questions to all panelists, turn it to all panelists and attendees, so that other attendees can also see questions. But we already see people in the chat function coming in and saying hello. So hello to everyone, and once again, and over to you, Fabio and Steve. I'll mute myself now.
Thank you very much, Yasmina. So I will start and welcome everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to present our work here. And this is going to be an appetizer of what you will find in the paper. The paper is quite dense and I would say rich in terms of information and reflection. So in 25 minutes, we hope to give you just some highlights of what we found, and especially of the many questions that came out as a result of our work. So as Yasmina was saying, this paper wants actually to help starting a discussion in terms of providing some definitions, some existing competence frameworks, so to equip UNICEF with some possible tools and possible approaches to then go on in this pretty complex field of digital literacy for children. What we did was a literature review of covering many different fields, from technology to development studies to a number of different fields. And then we interviewed 7 key stakeholders from all over the world. You can see there a number of them, and these were pretty rich moments where we had the chance to talk to people who are actually have been discussing these issues for many years. So it was very enriching for us to sort of enrich what we found through the literature review. And in the same time, we ran a survey that Steve is going to be presenting to you in a moment, where we received replies from 37 UNICEF offices around the globe. So it's not all of them, but it's a pretty good, I think, sample of what UNICEF is doing and what are the main challenges and so on. So a few points on literature review. Basically, the main findings of this is that both policy and research are going in the same direction if we talk about children digital literacy, and they are going towards a more comprehensive and holistic understanding of what it means today for kids to be literate and to be equipped to thrive in our knowledge societies. So there is a process from very instrumental definitions and understandings towards a more comprehensive one, which actually we were welcoming quite a lot. Then we found that virtually practically all major international organizations are giving priority to the field. UNESCO was mentioned, but also the European Commission, the Council of Europe, the OECD, any major organization that you can think of is actually devoting energy to digital literacy, normally focusing on citizens of all ages. So there is a space, we think, and we found for some specific work on children digital literacy. Then we found also that different labels exist. So some people, institutions are talking about digital literacy itself, which is the concept we decided to stick to. Others are talking about digital skills, digital citizenship, digital intelligence. There are, let's say, we believe that we tried in the paper to not to focus too much on the different labels, but actually on the content, what is within these labels. And there we found that the competencies, framework, or approaches seem to converge, in the sense that if you put if you confront the content of these frameworks and approaches, you find 5 or 6 areas that are appearing more or less all the time. So again, some important convergence. Then we found that many initiatives, both at the national level, especially at the national level, and at the international level, are using digital literacy frameworks, quite established, most of them being proposed by commercial organizations and just a few of them being developed ad hoc. So also there is some space, we believe, for UNICEF and for the research community to produce or to propose something, let's say, that doesn't come from the commercial sector. Then we found that the many existing initiatives are rarely evaluated and are, let's say, typically implemented in an ad hoc way, depending on the different context and the different states of development of the target populations. We found that despite efforts like Global Kids Online and other important efforts, there is still a lack of reliable global data on what it means today to be digital literate for children, and therefore more research and analysis is needed in this field. And then we confirmed sort of a number of findings especially by sociological research, that children's social environment is very important and schools are very important, parents of course are very important. Now in the paper we detailed this a bit better, but very importantly we found a need and an interest for collaboration and coordination that starts from local context. Of course, being digital literacy in a context, literate in a context means something very different, can mean something very different with respect to other contexts. So localization is possibly the first most important thing in what we found and in what we proposed. So this was a speedy run through the main findings that you can find well explained in the paper. And now, before reaching our proposals, what the paper is proposing, I would like to give the floor to Steve to go through the findings of the UNICEF survey. Steve.
Thanks, Fabio. So as Fabio said, we wanted to get a sense of what UNICEF is doing. And initially, this report was really for a UNICEF audience. We wanted to understand what the organization is doing around digital literacy and what our thoughts and approaches are. The paper is public, of course, because we want to engage more broadly with others on this topic. But this is the results of a survey, and it's by no means exhaustive. That's important to note. We sent to over 100 country offices. We received a response from 37 country offices and regional offices, very much around the world. So it's well distributed geographically, reporting on 40 initiatives. So these are initiatives in the last 5 years. And you can see that there's, as we look at these bullets, there's a fairly good balance in terms of focus. Just more than half of the initiatives we're looking at building competencies and digital skills, and a little less than half we're looking at internet safety as a topic. And of course, a lot of UNICEF's work around digital literacy has been focused on child online safety. In terms of age, again, it's a really good balance. Half the projects with young children, others with adolescents, and a few with both. And then in terms of educational context, about half in formal learning contexts and about the other half in non-formal, which is obviously very, very important because not all children are in school and digital literacy doesn't only have to be taught in schools. We saw that there's a real interest from governments from these different countries, and UNICEF has been responding to these fairly tailored requests. But the downside of that means that many of the projects are ad hoc. There's limited evaluation and there's limited coordination between the different countries. And I think in terms of what we found in the paper, this seems to be a global trend. It's not just UNICEF. This is an issue in the digital literacy space more broadly. Next slide, please. So we asked the countries, what are their main barriers to digital literacy? And we received a number of responses. These are the top 4, which will be familiar to anybody in this space. But it's lack of teachers and trainers' capacity. And it's interesting that it's not just their digital skills capacity, but it's also their almost a fear of approaching digital literacy and a fear of technology, or a certain anxiety around that. ICT infrastructure, so of course digital literacy happens in a much broader context. It's not just the skills, but you need a whole ecosystem around developing and using those skills. Connectivity, and especially for remote areas, and including due to cost. So that kind of talks again to that infrastructure. And then a lack of understanding from decision makers, and these could be policymakers who don't understand that digital literacy is a complex issue, that teacher training is essential, and this reflects itself sometimes in how digital projects are the headline is the number of tablets that are sent to a school, or the focus is on technology, where it's a much more complex issue. Okay. And then in terms of what are the main needs, so it was clear that our country offices get asked for support from the governments in those countries. The main points that highlighted were around policy guidelines, which ran the full gamut in terms of how do countries develop good digital literacy guidelines and policies, and even when that comes down to how do they partner well with industry and with NGOs and with researchers. There were calls for a comprehensive, a digital literacy competence framework, kind of a standard framework that they could use, curriculum guidelines, and then very practical tools, training manuals, toolkits, recommendations on platforms. So there's a lot of, there's interest from the governments, but there's also support needed. Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry, one last thing. In terms of how UNICEF thinks about digital literacy, and Bassam can talk to this a bit later, we wanted to just kind of locate it as one part of a framework that looks at kind of a holistic set of skills. So in terms of foundational skills in this diagram, that's literacy and numeracy. Transferable skills are your kind of your soft skills, your 21st century skills. Job specific as children get older and prepare for the workplace. And we see digital skills as being part of that holistic skill set that every child needs. And that's important, and that's really how the organization should be seeing it, and this is how we do from a planning and implementation perspective. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve. And then let's say, starting from the results of the literature review and with the input of the needs and challenges that are found on the ground every day by the UNICEF offices, and especially with the input of the interviews, we tried to come up with a definition and some competence frameworks that UNICEF could use in the future. Now, first of all, as you can imagine, many definitions exist out there, and some of them are more used. Most of them converge. You have some novel things, but playing with definitions is always a tricky game. And so we try to stick as much as possible to what is, let's say, already accepted and shared, and try as much as possible to adapt and to ground on the children needs the many existing definitions that, as I was saying before, are normally thought for all age citizens. And also when it comes to frameworks, we found a really broad number of frameworks. Just for you to know, the All Aboard project from Ireland has mapped more than 100 frameworks around the world focusing on digital literacy. Just a few of them are on children. But let's say there is a plethora of existing things. We tried to, let's say, limit ourselves to what is used, what is being proven to use, and what could be brought forward for the work of UNICEF. So this is the definition. Again, in the paper, you will find how we arrived to this definition, especially what are the different pieces of the definition that are most important, we believe, for the work of UNICEF. But this is the proposed definition that comes out from the paper. So digital literacy refers to knowledge, skills, and attitudes. This is a classic distribution of terms that allow children to flourish and thrive in an increasingly global digital world, being both safe and empowered. Again, here the dichotomy between the protectionist and the empowering paradigma that are coexisting all the time, in ways that are appropriate to their age and local cultures and contexts. This is bold in here because actually, especially for children, this comes very strongly from the interviews, the need to adapt as much as possible the work that UNICEF will be doing, and starting therefore from the definition to local culture, to local context, to local languages, and to local needs. This seems obvious, but actually, if you look at many programs that are, for example, using the classical commercial, you will know ICDL or others, let's say these frameworks are actually working pretty well. They are up to date quite a lot. Most of them take into account a number of contemporary issues, but they tend to be one solution fits all. And let's say what came out quite strongly from our work is that we need more tailored solution. And since the definition has to be used by UNICEF, this was the idea as a tool, as a working tool to advance the debate, we played this game. We actually broke down the definition into different building blocks, so to allow in the future UNICEF and other stakeholders to discuss and maybe to change or to improve different pieces of the definition. This is an idea we took from Ferrari when she was working from the European Commission, actually, and we think it's a good way to actually use the definition as a starting point for discussion. So I won't go in detail of that, but just for you to appreciate that we have different building blocks. We have the objects of the definition, then which activities the definition is covering, which modes of operation, so what do, let's say, we think and literature thinks that all these adverbs that should be at the center of the definition. Then the definition goes specific in terms of age and context, in terms of purpose of activities, starting with playing, actually, which is normally absent from these definitions, and from civic participation, and of course also learning and socializing, consuming and working. And finally, a reference to digital society, not just to using ICT, because actually one strong component, quite innovative component of the definition, and of the paper itself is that we try to embark all the activities that children do in digital societies, even when they are not using actually ICT, because to being digital literate today means also having an understanding of how, for example, digital companies are using your data, and even when you're not using ICT tools. So far away from instrumental understanding of literacy towards an holistic and a very much children-centered understanding. So again, the definition is better explained, and these building blocks are better explained also with some examples in the paper. And now we move to the frameworks. So in the discussion with our experts, in the interviews, we got some important feedback on how a framework that UNICEF should be using and proposing to governments and to offices should look like. So first of all, it should be technology neutral and applicable as it is to different contexts and especially usable for children, so very much contextualized. It should be usable and we should, let's say, start from what exists and from what has been already used, from what has been already criticized and improved. So you will see that in the proposals we made, we opted for some frameworks that have already a history. Then the focus on children is not obvious. Again, if you move the lens on children, practically everything changes into a framework. I wouldn't say that the areas change, but the approach changes within every competence area. So we tried also to keep this into account when revising, reviewing, and selecting, proposing some frameworks for UNICEF, and that we try together with the framework to propose some guidelines on how to adapt the framework and how to use the framework in different contexts and different settings. Just think about the number of languages, or local languages that exist in some cultures, in some contexts, and of course, just to accommodate this small component into a frame, small but very important component into a framework is already, for example, changing quite a lot the nature of the framework. And then we had to select a few frameworks that we think could be starting points for UNICEF in helping through its local offices, governments, and other stakeholders in developing digital literacy for children. So we start from a pretty known one, the DigComp by the European Commission, is probably the most used and the most known digital competence framework, I would say, on the planet, and that has represented the basis for the UNESCO Global Competence Framework, which is a slightly adapted version of this. We think is pretty comprehensive. Of course, everything could be improved, and the good thing about this framework is that it was not born for children, but it has been used already for children, and it has been already also checked with Global Kids Online, and European Kids Online, so to try to map the different areas of competence with respect to children. Another one specific for children and specific or very much usable in developing contexts is the Digital Kids Framework developed by the Asia Pacific Office of UNESCO. You can quickly see there the domains of competence that are not too different, for example, from the ones by DigComp. So as I was saying before, there is a pretty good convergence among these efforts. And so this is also something that has been tested, that has been used already. And so it's a ready to use tool for UNICEF. And then there are two more frameworks that we suggest as alternative options, let's say, possible other options. One is a quite new framework called the Digital Intelligence Framework that is pretty broad in terms of areas and in terms of its understanding of literacy or intelligence in this case. The very good thing about this framework is that it is equipped already with a number of learning tools and resources to develop these frameworks already through a digital platform. And the last one is the one by the Council of Europe, the Digital Citizenship Education Framework that has been also worked out through a number of iterations. And this is the peak of the iceberg of the very good work that the Council of Europe is doing in the area of digital citizenship. As you can see there, also values, attitudes, skills, and and knowledge and critical understanding. So let's say, as you can understand, and as you will see in the paper, convergence is there not only in terms of terms and in terms of areas of competencies, but also in terms of approach. So this is something which made our life easier when we had to, let's say, select or at least propose some possible frameworks. Now, Steve, for you, to the way ahead. We are ping-ponging a bit, but I think it's...
Thanks, Fabio. Well, this is what you get with co-authors, so thank you for that. Okay, so looking ahead, there are just two slides. So the one is kind of for UNICEF, and the one is, I guess, more broadly. We thought that talking to the country officers and doing the research for the paper, that UNICEF clearly has a chance to play a key role in the field of digital literacy, and our value add could be bringing the focus to children. It's good to take a holistic approach, what we're doing right now, and we should continue to take that approach and encourage others to do the same and to contextualize digital literacy as one part of a holistic set of skills and values and attitudes. And then also really play a part in shaping and supporting research and analysis around children's digital literacy. And this talks to Fabio's point right in the beginning, that there's a real lack of good data. There's a lack of consistent research. There's a lot of interest, but it seems that this is a good time for much more collaboration and much more knowledge sharing, and to kind of consolidate and rationalize this field so that everyone who's interested can actually contribute much more effectively. So Fabio, last slide, please. You know, we asked the interviewers for some ideas and proposals, the expert interviews, and also what we had discussed ourselves. So these are not things that we are necessarily going to do, but these were some nice ideas that we wanted to share. The first is that many of the stakeholders that we spoke to were really interested in collaborating with UNICEF. So this is something, that we are happy to do. But it was encouraging for us that there's a real desire to collaborate and to work together. Some ideas were something called a collaborative observatory on children's digital literacy. And we could set that up with a range of partners: UNESCO, ITU, Council of Europe, JRC from the European Commission, USAID, whoever wants to be interested in joining. And that would potentially look at joint research, focus on particular research for a particular year, share findings from the field. That could also look at things like digital skills foresight. So what are some of the digital skills that are needed, not just today, but into the future? And how do we think ahead? And then there was also a really nice idea about creating an open data repository. And a few partners here, organizations, had suggested this and are sitting on digital literacy data that they would be happy to share, obviously in a very private, safe, anonymized way. There would be some work to do here because the data is in different formats and based on different frameworks, but still it's something worth thinking about. And then lastly, an official shared glossary. So there is, as anyone in this field knows, a lot of different terms used. As Fabio said, there's convergence, but there's still, it doesn't help the feel that we're kind of talking about the same thing, but using different language. And so perhaps that's something to look at. That's it, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Thank
that's
you
it.
very much.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Have you finished? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to, just a comment on these proposals. Actually, it was interesting, the fact that from the interviews, these proposals came out more than one time. So it seems that there is already some sort of convergence on what should be done in the future. And again, as Steve was saying, a genuine interest for collaboration. So I just wanted to stress that this doesn't come from us as researchers, but actually are really the words and the ideas from the institutions and the experts we interviewed. And this was possibly the most interesting and rewarding part, where, you know, when you do something and you have an understanding that this can bring immediately to something else.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. And I just, before I give a floor to Bassem, wanted to say the fact that we showcased 4 frameworks here doesn't mean that we endorse these over other frameworks that exist. It just means that these are the frameworks that we wanted to show as different approaches that particularly meet the needs of UNICEF. However, there are many excellent frameworks out there that we couldn't fit into this paper, and that we hope that will encourage you to also look and examine. Some of those are listed here also, like the QI framework and others. And now over to you, Bassem, to tell us a little bit more about the education, UNICEF's education program approach to digital literacy in the context of skills.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Jasmina, and thank you, Stephen and Fabio, for your excellent presentation. And I was glad to be a part that kind of reviewed this paper. So I think in terms of sort of just adding to the discussion, I'd like to reflect on what we've heard from a UNICEF education perspective, and it's very eerie and uncanny that the work on digital literacy is very much paralleling a lot of the sort of the journey that many countries and many institutions are taking, have taken with regards to another sort of type of skill, which we are calling the life skills and the transferable skills. Many of the challenges, many of the journeys, there are many frameworks and many challenges lie ahead. In very much the same way, I have been involved in this work for the past maybe 5 years with UNICEF, and there is no short cutting some of those challenges. It's how we sort of advance this agenda is through meeting, consensus building, engaging, building knowledge, piloting, collecting data. There's no basically, and it seems to me this paper is a really good starting point for a journey, also for UNICEF to start addressing this agenda. A few reflections from my side. I think there are a couple of things in terms of sort of the principles of digital literacy in which UNICEF can sort of add value and move this conversation forward. I think one of them is definitely, as you guys have mentioned, is the idea of making them much more children focused and children's rights. But for UNICEF also, the issue of equity is extremely important. And so for us is how do we make these frameworks also more equitable and realize that we are working in many of the countries where there's little connectivity, where there are a lot of people who are out of school, where there are a lot of marginalized groups. So this is definitely an area that I think an organization like UNICEF can have a basic contribution. The idea basically of human rights is also extremely important in embedding in all sort of all these frameworks. I think it's in some of the frameworks that have been reviewed, it is more apparent than others. Now, when it comes to how do we demonstrate sort of learning or outcomes, I think one of the challenges for digital literacy, which is you know, maybe even beyond the social emotional life and transferable skills, is that digital literacy, and especially for UNICEF, is encompassing many things. It's not one thing. It's skills, it's knowledge. So for UNICEF as a whole, it means actually many different sections would need to work on this agenda beyond education. So this is for the UNICEF colleagues who are attending the webinar. This requires sort of a UNICEF broad vision on this concept of digital literacy that is most likely anchored in education, but that actually requires a lot of sectors working on this together. So by design, that makes it a bit more complicated. Programmatically, I have I'm reflecting on the journey that we had with life skills and transferable skills. I was one of the people who worked with UNICEF in the MENA region to start pushing the life skills and social emotional learning in a very intentional way towards scale and towards embedding in governments in learning systems. So I think the idea here is we really need to sort of embed digital literacy within education systems to ensure that all children are developing digital literacy as part of a holistic learning. So one of the things that I found pretty useful as we did work in MENA is the notion of getting people around a shared agenda. And that is intensive and hard work. And so one of the things that was done in MENA over the past couple of years that is starting to bear fruit right now is the notion of, you know, large national consultations or even regional consultations in which all the stakeholders that are concerned with digital literacy get together and really try to define what they're trying to achieve. So that could work really on a national level. And it's very helpful where you bring in the private sector, you bring in civil society, you bring in young people themselves, you bring in government, different parts of the government, ministries of labor, ministries of education, ministries of social planning. And you really have sort of stakeholder engagement dialogues that are very structured by experts to really try to figure out what we mean by these terminologies and what we're trying to do. Because absent from that, you're gonna be having conflicting approaches, you're gonna be having ad hoc approaches that are probably not gonna where the notion of let 1,000 flower blooms is probably not gonna be that effective. That work is hard, but if there's commitment and if there's vision, then that's probably one of the best investments of time. It's a really good way. I've seen it in action. If it's done intentionally right, and if it's done in a proper way, it can yield fruit. Regional work on this is also very helpful because many of the regions share many characteristics, so it can help drive shared learning. Programmatically, when I realize we're not going to get rid of all these ad hoc programs. So I think just to build on what Steve is saying, the one recommendation that I would have is to really try to collect as much data as possible. I think that is probably it's a hard thing because what do we collect? But from a general perspective, I think many of the programs are not evaluated, and so then it's even hard to even have a discussion about how you move them to scale. So even if you have minimal data, qualitative data, you're at least able to have a conversation to move forward to the next level, to think of how you embed these in national education systems or how you scale these programs. Lastly, I really want to talk about sort of the differences in terminologies and my perspective on the terminology issue. From my perspective, this is an issue we face in all sorts of skills. You should see the terminology challenges we're facing in sort of the issues of social emotional learning, how people define something like problem solving differently, how people define creativity differently. And I think actually, to be honest, that conversation will probably not be solved. I have been involved in meetings that have lasted 4 days trying to come to convergence across technologies. I have a practical tip that I've taken from a professor at Harvard called Stephanie Jones, who's working on social emotional learning, who is working on a project actually that maps so many frameworks on social emotional learning and tries to provide the connection. If there's any interest, I can share that website. But the basic tip is, if you're talking to somebody about a particular term, ask them what they mean and explain to them what you mean by that term. I think that's a really good practical way for you to start understanding if you're talking about the same thing, because you assuming you're talking about the same thing might be not the right thing. Once again, thanks so much, Steve. And finally, actually, from a UNICEF perspective, like from the education team, this is an area where we're actually getting a lot of interest in moving forward this agenda. So over the next year, we're going to be basically looking at how do we support countries in moving this agenda more intentionally and to really embed the digital literacy within and build digital literacy within education systems. And we'll be sharing with colleagues later on some of the thinking around this, but I think this paper actually provides a really good starting point for much of the hard work ahead. So thanks so much, Steve and Jasmina and Fabio.
Thank you, Bassem, and we are really happy that we had this great collaboration with our education colleagues. So now I would like to, I see we already have some questions in the chat box, and I would like to just read one comment and a couple of questions to our panelists. One comment from Anthony Bloom, who says, this is an excellent webinar. It would be exciting to attract attention to the Digital Literacy Observatory. So apparently there is still interest. And other collaboration activities with this year's Education Alliance symposiums and steering committee meeting. This year event is focused on digital literacy and skills for education and development, so something that we should definitely follow up. There was one question that was posted to us over email, and I'm going to address this to you, Steve, and then I'll read another question for you, Fabio, and then we'll move to other questions. So one of our colleagues who works actually in adolescent programming asks about how to work with different age groups, different physical and mental capacities, and with certain vulnerabilities. So we talked about different ages and culture, but really in addition to limited access to internet or social media or language abilities, there are those who have less opportunities compared to others due to their abilities. Steve?
Sure, thanks, Yasmina. I think it's a really good question. And I think that the important thing is that digital literacy is important. Digital literacy is for everybody. In this case, the way it's applied for children with different abilities would be different. And so it needs to be, again, as we said earlier, the way digital literacy is taught and developed needs to be very much in response to the local context and to the abilities of the children. So the way it's taught would be different, the way it's assessed would be different, the way some children may need more protection in addition to the kind of empowerment lens. Even with limited access, that's obviously the reality for most kids around the world in developing countries, especially in the school system. It is still possible to teach digital literacy with low digital kind of infrastructure. It's not ideal, of course, but for example, if coding is something that's being developed in a low infrastructure setting, one could focus more on the concepts of coding and of logic and of kind of sequential programming. So it's not ideal, but again, it's important. Everybody should be engaging with digital literacy based on their local context.
Thanks, Steve. Now, there was a question for Fabio from Kumar Vivek from the education team of the World Bank. He says, thanks for a presentation. The building blocks of definition are fantastic and really get into the crux of thinking more broadly about this topic. I was wondering if we could add some form of where these skills are delivered as the building blocks, schools, homes, or a mix of various environments. Just something that might help expand the thinking.
Yeah, well, I would say absolutely yes, and that's simply a great idea. Actually, I'm glad to see that the building blocks idea is working to start some discussions. And actually, the where is a very critical question because it automatically makes you think about formal and informal learning, which is a transversal, I would say, underground debate, an elephant in the room in all the reports you have been reading, and also many policies. Just to mention one, the very late policy from Portugal on digital literacy stresses a lot the informal learning dimension, but then if you look at what they are doing, it's mostly formal. So I think focusing on the where will automatically make you understand from the definition, from the start, that this is not only in schools, it's not only outside schools, it's both, as you say. So thank you very much. I think this is for the version 2.0 is a perfect, very good adding to the blocks.
Thanks, Fabio. So we also have a colleague from Japan who was writing to us, Hiromasa, who was saying that while our office in Japan is not necessarily working directly on programming, we have entities like Google and Yahoo Japan who wish to associate and work in this area. So how does Unicef, especially us at the headquarters, do we work with these companies? That's also something we can discuss with you, Hiromasa, offline. and talk to you about how we can best support you. But Steve, do you want to say just a couple of words about it? We can't hear you. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, we are interested because it's digital literacy obviously plays out very differently in different parts of the world. So we'd be interested in finding out what those companies are doing, what happens there. So let's definitely follow up offline, please. But it's important that we understand digital literacy approaches and lessons learned from Japan to Nigeria. It's all important. Thank you.
Great. I'm trying to go through all these questions. So there's Tony here from ICT and Education Lead in USAID. He's asking, how broadly do we define digital technologies? Does this principle include internet, computer-based, and also training children, use adults on use of radio and video platforms and other standalone technologies? And Steve, you just addressed this, but could you introduce digital literacy concept into early foundational content, even that there are no immediate access to the internet? Yeah. For example, featuring kids engaged in STEM topics. So that's kind of a mix for both you, Steve and Bassem.
Yes. Yeah.
But
go ahead, Steve.
Okay. No, and thank you, Tony, for that question. And for those who don't know, Tony Bloom, ICT4E lead at USAID, and a great colleague and the organizer of the M Education Alliance Symposium, which is a very, it's an amazing event. So everyone should try and be there, especially because it's focusing on this topic. So Tony, yes, we take a very broad view of technology. And even as Fabio said earlier, it's not even a child in front of some technical device. It's the whole digital ecosystem that affects that child, even when they're not kind of online themselves. Which is a bit of a shift, because it used to be kind of, as you know, very child in front of computer. That was the image that comes to mind. And so we need to move away from that. And yes, we definitely should be introducing these topics at a younger age. What's interesting is that we're also doing work on AI policies, but looking at them from a child lens. And the recent UK AI national strategy talks about introducing AI-related topics even at the primary school level, and getting children to think ethically and critically around the design of products and digital tools and how they get used. So sure, it should happen earlier. It will look different, of course. And in the paper, we do note some nice examples. For example, the government of British Columbia takes their digital literacy framework and gives really nice lesson plans and curriculum mapping for about 5 different age groups, including the very young age. And so similar principles, but the approach and where the focus is obviously different, but we should start early. Yeah.
So Bassem, did you want to add
Yeah. I think we're starting to get to some of those. To some of those, I think it's really important for us to really stress that at the heart of achieving learning or digitally literate children, at the core of it, whenever you're embedding them in an education system, you must align the content that you're teaching, the pedagogy through which you're teaching, and how you are assessing those. Any one of those components that's out of whack, because your learning outcomes are not sort of maximized. So I think there's a lot of room and work ahead of us for trying to understand how we embed digital literacy within education system in terms of defining standards that are age appropriate, that are grade appropriate for the components of digital literacy that can then be eventually embedded in curricular frameworks where teachers can basically be trained to teach those and embed them within the different subject matters. The challenge with this, so this is one challenge. The challenge is a conceptual challenge of understanding what it means for a child who is 7 years old versus a child who's 12 years old to be digitally literate, and what that actually means in terms of what you're actually doing in the classroom. And I think we have a long way ahead for us to really start teasing these things out in a way that actually has proven its worth in progressively. The other thing is, we have to, as a UNICEF, we have to bear in mind that we are working in education systems that are already very low capacity systems. So how do we take this conceptual challenge and apply it to education systems where teachers are not well equipped, not well resourced, not of the highest quality? And I think these are some of the challenges where we need to sort of maybe start piloting some of these frameworks, make some hard choices about where we focus, what things we focus on, and build progressively. I think the frameworks give us a good starting point, but a lot of these frameworks have been developed in developing countries and Western countries. And I think the notion of then moving forward to some of the areas in the countries where we work in present several conceptual but also operational challenges that we need to progressively work on.
Thank you so much, Bassem. So we have a couple of more questions from actually Unicef country offices, and I'm going to read both of them so Fabio and Steve can respond and also say maybe a couple of last words before we close. So here's from Florian from Unicef Kenya country office. Thanks for presenting the results, and good to see the input from country offices that are synthesized in a global report. Kenya's government has done massive investments into digital literacy, which is the focus on hardware, but does not yield results and fruit as expecting. So the country office that working on implementing a shared value partnership with the private sector to address these challenges by connecting schools to the internet, increase the availability of digital quality content and teacher training, as well as designing creative computing and coding interventions. So question, based on your research, how can the growing interest of private sector partners, as mentioned by the colleague from Japan above, best be channeled into meaningful programmatic interventions across Unicef offices, especially in countries with limited digital infrastructure? So that was one question. And then we have also a question from Maria Jose Velas, who is from
Bolivia.
Yes. So she is, sorry, I'm just struggling with this. Thank you for the webinar. A comment concerning the factors that include the digital literacy. In fact, for example, in Bolivia, narratives of fear to technologies are very present, which means that parents are censoring the use of new media to kids' risks such as child pornography, trafficking, etc. As you said, it is important to take into account the characteristics of info-included kids that do not have the best internet connections, access to education. It's important to take into account the gender divide as well, something that we haven't mentioned today, and that divide is very wide in some of the developing countries. So the question, do you have any good examples and experiences about a collaborative observatory on children's digital literacy? So maybe Stephen, you can tell us a bit how we can work with the private sector, and Fabio, any examples of observatory? And yes.
So thank you. Those are both great questions. In my experience, because my background is in educational technology, it is important, and in fact, in most cases, necessary to work with the private sector. So that's not a bad thing. They bring a lot of resources, they bring infrastructure, connectivity, and this space really has a lot of different stakeholders in the whole digital literacy and ICT and education ecosystem. I think the main thing is just to come into it with eyes wide open, especially if it's a government-driven program like in Kenya, to be sure that the curriculum comes first, to be sure that relationships with private companies don't lock you into licensing agreements, that the total cost of ownership is considered, that the digital literacy programs or curriculum that they propose aren't just promoting their products and learning on their platforms, but are more rounded. And we actually saw in the paper that most governments go with digital literacy curricula that are developed by private sector companies, because it's a package, and governments respond well to a total solution. So it's helpful, it's there, they're not bad, but the children, the curriculum, the education system comes first, and that's very important to make sure that that you don't get locked into anything that you don't support.
Yeah, Well, actually,
a couple of minutes because we are.
Yeah, I'll be super quick actually on this. Being equipped to work with the private sector, I wanted to mention the very nice ITU report with policy guidelines. Actually, it's a nice report that is exactly aiming at building capacity of decision makers to work with these things, and so for them to be ready actually to work with the private sector. Then in terms of examples of an observatory on this, well, not in this field, because in this field such an observatory doesn't exist, and that's why it would be nice to have it. And I think an observatory as a concept could embed also the data sharing component and maybe the foresight. So that's possibly the winning word for the future could be. I know that, well, there were a number of collaborative efforts in the past. One that I know on media literacy, actually, which is a totally different field. Again, definitions, they share the word literacy, but it's a different field, which is run by the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. And this is something which is working with the European Commission and others. I don't know how global that is, but there are a few examples of collaborative observatories on digital aspects of life. And then one last point, I saw the question being put twice from Japan on this this need to specify, that this is for kids working and living in digital and connected environments and societies. I totally agree that we should move towards skipping this, and that's why we put "and societies", because normally in definitions, digital literacy refers to what you're doing online, which is a good standpoint, a logical standpoint. Here we wanted to specify by adding the word connected societies that this applies also to things that kids do when they are offline, because this, as you say, is not in Japan only, it's everywhere. I mean, there is actually no boundary. So actually another good point for the definition could be already taking off the environments. Actually, those are digital and connected societies, and the environments are just part of it. So I would say it's a very good suggestion also for the definition itself.
Thank you so much. I was going to refer to that comment, but I'm glad you addressed it. We've come to the end of our webinar. I first want to thank our panelists for your really great work on this paper and for your presentations. And thank you, Bassem, for giving us this kind of a sense of what it really means when it comes to programming in the field where we work. Thank you to all of you who have joined us today, especially to colleagues from Unicef country offices and colleagues from other organizations, World Bank, USAID here with us. I see that some are already making connections. As we are saying, this is just the beginning of the work for us in this area and the first exploratory piece, and we hope that by reaching out to you we have kind of managed to at least incite some interest and that we continue working in this area. The idea of observatory seems to be coming again very strongly, and we'll see how we can follow up on that, at least from our part. Also to mention again the Bassem's point about not only focusing on children but equity, and ensuring that every child, whether has different abilities or lives in different places or minority or different ethnic groups, can all benefit equally from living in a digital society. So we are right on time, 1 hour, and I want to thank you all again. This webinar is recorded. We'll share the link with those who couldn't attend, and we'll ask you to share with your colleagues who work in this field who couldn't join us today. We are aware of the time differences and problems with connecting from other parts of the world. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.